Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Supplier diversity, it's always been a topic of interest for procurement organizations. And in many cases, it's really become, for an organization, really a strategic imperative. But there's a big difference between having a supplier diversity program that checks the boxes and one that is actually driving measurable outcomes. And so in today's podcast, we deep dive into the business side of supplier diversity and how procurement leaders can make the business case for broadening the lens of its supplier pool beyond it just being the right thing to do. So I'm joined on today's podcast by Jamie Crump. Jamie is president of the Richmond Group and author of Backstage Pass, pulling the curtain back on the business of supplier diversity. Jamie's enjoyed a 20-plus year career across a number of procurement leadership roles, and today she provides consulting and coaching services to corporate and certified diversity-owned businesses in the area of strategic sourcing, procurement strategies, and supplier diversity initiatives. So I kick off the podcast by asking Jamie, as I often do, if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
Procurement definitely found me, as is the case with a lot of people in my generation. I think you couldn't go to university for it at that time. But yeah, I was working for a welding and medical supply, and they couldn't keep me busy. So they finally said, well, go help out the guy who runs purchasing. And I started helping him. And 2 years later, I was running the department.
Right.
So I really liked it. I had kind of a knack for it. But yeah, I never grew up going, yeah, that's what I want to do. I didn't even know that job existed.
Yeah, I think most of us are like that. It's like, what the heck is this? Oh, this is actually quite interesting. Kind of stick with it and you go from there. Now, one of the things that we want to do, and really the main focus of the discussion, the conversation today, is around supplier diversity and the book that you recently authored that you published. As we record this, the middle of July, it was a week or two ago, called Backstage Pass. And the question that I really have to start to tee up that conversation is, why supplier diversity? How is that? How did you get involved in supplier diversity to the point where you obviously have all this knowledge and experience that makes a book like this, so impactful?
Well, I think that I've been in supply chain my whole career, and most of that has been in indirect, and that's usually where companies look to for the best supplier diversity results. Mm-hmm. So indirect also allows you to work with all different types of industries because everybody needs the stuff you're buying, the infrastructure, goods and services. So, I worked for a bank, I worked for a technology company, I worked for the phone company, pharmaceutical. All of them had supplier diversity programs in one form or another. My banking career was in Detroit, and so we had Ford and GM coming to us and saying, this is something that you need to be paying attention to. Yeah. So through all of that, I was always working with supplier diversity. In my last corporate gig, I was 11 years in heavy equipment rental, and I actually built out both indirect and supplier diversity for them and had responsibility for both. So when I went out on my own in 2017, I wanted to consult in both areas, and I felt like I had something different to bring to the table because I had sat on both sides of the desk in terms of being responsible for both of them. I started looking for reference material that I could tell clients about. And there was a lot out there about diversity and inclusion, hearts and minds, which is all good. Mm-hmm. There were some things out there about the economics. You know, you spend $1 here, and here's how it translates in the communities, and that's good. But my best results had always been when I approached it like a business strategy. When I went into the C-suite looking for funding or support, I was approaching it the same way I would if I wanted software mm-hmm. funding. And I found that helped me both get the funding and then hang on to the funding.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's one of those things that could be on a chopping board.
Because you tie it to revenue, right? Yeah. So, and when I started looking for that information, I didn't find a lot. So that and, you know, meeting up with Publish Your Purpose, the publisher, who has the academy, who kind of helps you through that process, mm-hmm. I just decided that I would take a stab at writing it myself.
So I want to come to the kind of the business case of supply diversity in a little while, because I think that's so important, you know, in my experience of, mm-hmm. You know, when you look at trying to make the case or the business case for supply diversity initiatives. Yeah. But before I go there, I want to go a little bit more, I don't know, maybe it's an easier question. It's really setting the context. But when we talk about supply diversity, you know, is there a singular definition or a way to look at what supply diversity is? I mean, what is supply diversity to you? How should most companies be thinking about the term even supply diversity?
Well, to me, supplier diversity is bringing the diversity and inclusion that we hear people talking about within their organizations into your entire supply chain. Mm-hmm. So if you think about, you know, here's the diversity results we get by having an employee base that's diverse. Now think about taking that and leveraging it throughout your entire supply chain. Yeah. So who is supplier diversity? I think that's any group who's been disadvantaged, and that can come in various forms. It can be, you know, racial or ethnic. Yep. It can be, you know, sexual orientation. Yeah. It can be veterans who have sacrificed the years that, you know, most of us spend going to college and growing our business career, serving the country, and then trying to come back in and get caught up. So it can be, you know, various things, but all of that contributes to the most diverse supply chain, and that's where the best business results reside.
And you mentioned in the book around, you know, tying that business success is often the level of diversity you have across your supply chain being a big driver of business success. And I just wonder if you could elaborate that a little bit more to kind of give some, you know, what are the reasons behind your statement? Because I just love to know a little bit, because I think that ties into business case.
No, it definitely ties into the business case. And it's a lot of the initial conversation you're having with companies who are considering whether they want to do this or not. But, you know, now there's just a lot of data out there that shows the benefits of it. So, for example, American Sociological Review did a study in 2009, and what they found was that companies that reported the highest levels of racial diversity brought in nearly 15 times more sales revenue on average than those with lower levels. Okay, that's, you know, those are business numbers. Yeah. They also found that, you know, every percentage increase at the rate of racial or gender diversity, there was also an increase in sales. And it was like 9% for racial and 3% for gender. So, again, those are business numbers. Shift a little bit differently. In 2018, Harvard Business Review did a study. And they looked at, I think it was like 1,700 or 1,800 companies across 8 or 10 different countries. Yeah. And in all of them, they found that when there's diversity in management positions, there's a statistically significant relationship between diversity and innovation. So, again, you know, more leading edge, which, again, creates more wealth, right? And then McKinsey has been studying this for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years now. So in the book, I talk about their 2018 report, Diversity Matters, which they had done over the course of several years. And they had found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their industry competition. And that same study also showed that the companies in the bottom quartile for gender and ethnicity were statistically less likely to achieve above financial. So, it had you coming and going there. So, I mean, that's what I'm talking about when I say, the data's there, that there's real business results to be had. This isn't just, this is what we should all be doing. It is what we should all be doing. But
yeah, there's a business case you can make as well as it being the right thing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, a very strong business case. Yeah. Yes.
Now, something that, as you're talking about some of those numbers, I don't think this is a question that has an irrefutable answer. But one of the things that comes to mind is, when you think about those organizations that are obviously having much stronger results and that correlates with their level of diversity across their supply base and their supply chain, how much of this is because those organizations who are diverse organizations are bringing different capabilities. You talked about innovation. They're doing things that aren't necessarily, the typical company that somebody may engage with isn't doing. How much is it down to those, and how much is it down to actually the cultural change within an organization that looks at supply diversity as being the right thing to do, and therefore it's driving their decision making, and that is naturally impacting the business in other ways because they're more of an open organization, more appreciating more diversity of thought as an organization.
Well, that's a great point. I think it's both, because I think if you are seeking that out, Business Insider also did a study. I think that was 2017, and they looked at different things that they were finding in diverse organizations, and they found that diverse groups are just better at focusing on facts. Yeah. They think about facts more carefully, and they're just more innovative. And I think that comes from bringing different ideas and backgrounds and thought processes to the table than just everybody having the same one.
No, absolutely.
And now, you can be a diverse person in an organization that doesn't appreciate that, and it's not going to make much difference. So I think the open-mindedness and the acknowledgement of it has to be there as well, or it's just a big missed opportunity.
Yeah. Now, when you're building a business case for a supply diversity program within an organization, and one that has teeth, not one that is necessarily, and I hate to use this term, but more of a vanity project. And I say that because I've had experience of being, in organizations and being involved in supply diversity where, frankly, that was the purpose.
Right.
You make the business case. Do you also have to make kind of the social case to help leaders in an organization recognize that obviously the business case drives the decision, but there are other reasons why this is important?
Well, you have to have that conversation. I don't think you can go into a business and just treat it strictly as the business case and be blissfully unaware of the rest. You're gonna shoot yourself in the foot at some point if you take that approach. I think one thing that's key, though, is that when you go in and do it from the business approach, it also helps you establish an area that's safe. One of the things I've always told, the C-suite when I worked with them, if you think you have a question that's, politically incorrect or, something you shouldn't really be thinking, I want you to ask me. I don't want you to ask somebody else.
Yeah.
And, I'm never going to judge you. I'm going to give you the answer, and I'm going to be candid about it. But, you need to be able to have that dialogue because they have to understand. And, rightly or wrongly, there's some aspects that they don't necessarily understand.
Now, when you're making that case for investment in supply diversity, what kind of ROIs on a program basis should a company be looking at? What's more effective? We talked about the ultimate benefit, that ties the top line, But that's a little bit removed, from a typical chief procurement officer, for example. So how should they be looking at supply diversity and measuring its success?
Well, I think that it depends. And there's two things that I look at when I'm determining how I'm going to approach it. One is when I'm looking at a company, who are their customers?
Yeah.
If it's a B2C company, then your concerns are much more around the population demographic of your buying community. If you're a B2B company, then you have to be concerned about the programs and business strategies that your large customers have.
Yeah.
If you're both, you need both of those. So, double the reason. But in both of those cases, you need to look at what are they looking for.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the general community, those demographics, they want to do business with people, like them.
Yeah.
And, we're getting much smarter about that now. You used to be able to just keep that under the rug, so to speak. Nobody really knew. Now, with social media and with all of the information that's available online, we know who's playing and who isn't.
Yeah, and the media will be quick to share that.
Yeah, and we know, yes, exactly. And we know who's serious about it and who isn't.
Yeah.
And, I talk in the book about you vote every time you spend $1. So I don't buy gasoline from companies that don't have strong supplier diversity programs. Mm-hmm. I don't buy cereal from companies that don't have strong supplier diversity programs. And you're seeing more and more people are doing that. So that's one approach that I take with them. And then, of course, the top line that we already talked about. The other that I think gets missed as well is that when you're dealing with these companies, you're getting better solutions in many cases, more thought-provoking solutions in many cases. Because, again, you're getting that innovation. And then finally, it's huge in terms of recruiting and retaining talent. I interviewed a partner at EY not long ago, and I asked, he talked about that, it was mostly the, in their 20s out of college set that they hired.
Yeah.
And I said, do they expect diversity in the organization? He said, they don't expect it. They demand it. Mm-hmm. And if we can't show it, we're not going to get the best talent. And if we pretend like we're showing it, they're not going to stick around if it's not for real.
So do you see that more organizations are becoming proactive rather than reactive? And that reactive is, you talked about it in Detroit, where you have the automakers who are requiring, and ironically, that's where I first got involved in supply diversity. Was exactly the same situation, actually, with those same automakers, requiring it. And so we reacted as an organization who was supporting those automakers to say, okay, it's been demanded by them. We need to put something in place. And, away you go. And why you put that in place is probably because you just want to be able to demonstrate a certain number back to your customers so they don't come and dig a little bit deeper, unfortunately. So you see now that companies are really taking this more seriously and proactively, kind of creating their own burning platform, if you will, for investment.
Yes.
Good.
And I think that's absolutely true. And I'm like you. I mean, GM and Ford were the ones that got me off the ground. Yeah. So, they were doing meetings for their suppliers, and, here's what it is. And, that's the first place I heard it was there in Detroit. So, I think that for companies to get on the bandwagon, so to speak, and we've seen some of this, companies are coming out with, Black Lives Matters and different statements that they're doing. And I saw an interesting response in LinkedIn recently where a company came out with, here we believe and we support, and a lady wrote in and she said, could I see a picture of your board of directors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, putting the ad out isn't enough anymore.
No.
People are savvy to that. And, it's like, okay, but what are you doing? And I think that one of the best ways to influx the community to, the rising tide lifts all boats concept is when you have it in your supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's not just the dollars you're spending, that's all of the companies who are doing business with you. And then they, in turn, take it forward with their supply chain. And that's where I think you're going to see the biggest economic impact is when you're truly, truly doing it in the spirit with which it was intended, which is, how do we get good solutions? Because it has to make business sense.
Mm-hmm.
But get the best innovation and get the dollar spending with those diverse-owned businesses.
Yeah. Now, in the book, you talk about a cast of characters, the folks within an organization, typically in executive and leadership roles, who are actually involved in supply diversity and kind of, their relationship with diversity itself. And I just wonder if you could share a little bit more about kind of your thinking putting together that cast of characters, who those characters are and the roles that they play.
Sure. A lot of being on both sides of this over the course of my career and being an indirect, which typically means that your internal clients are the C-suite because they're the ones buying that stuff. I've seen the ones that interact well and the ones that do it not so well.
Mm-hmm. And
it really comes down to how well I believe these 5 characters interact with each other. So you have the C-suite, from which, all funding and strategy flows.
Yeah.
You have the supplier diversity professional, who's going to be responsible for making sure this gets up and stays off the ground. You have the supply chain professional, who has to understand the importance, not just to the supplier diversity strategy, but to their own success as well. You have the diverse business owner who really has to think beyond the matchmaking. They have to provide information that 2 levels from the supplier diversity professional is going to be looking for. And then you have the one that I think is overlooked the most, and that's the end user,
mm-hmm.
who actually has the highest stake in this because they're living with the results. And yet, very often, they invest the least in making sure that, they're getting what they should be getting.
And change is hardest for that person because, like you say, they're dealing with the day-to-day impact of whichever supplier is chosen, and they're happy with their incumbent. That's a tough switch.
Well, and I think they're the less, they have the least amount of, change as part of my life,
mm-hmm.
right? Diversity is all paid to make that happen. Supply chain, that's basically what they do, is implement change, So, yeah, I think the end user has, in some ways, the largest hill to climb. But by the same token, they also have the biggest gain if it goes well.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you about the cast of characters, as you will, that you talked about there, is the diverse business owner, the small business owner. And, as we've gone through many iterations of supply diversity programs, which again, we talked about before, a lot are reactive, may not have been that serious in terms of, it's opening a registration portal and saying, hey, why don't you register your company details here? And then, that just goes into a black hole and nobody's ever contacts you. And, you kind of looking there thinking, why bother? So I guess my question is, from an organization, like from a buying organization perspective, what can we do to be more proactive? And I don't want to use the word serious, but to make it easier to kind of solicit diverse business owners, small business owners, to engage with you as a company and do it in a way where, they're not just feeling like they're going into a black hole again and, here we go again.
Right. No, I get it. And I actually do quite a rant on registration portals in the book. But, I think one of the biggest things is I see a lot of companies where, supply chain and supplier diversity are almost placed at odds with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first point is their goals and objectives have to be aligned. You can't have, we're going to pay supply chain to reduce the supply base, and supplier diversity is we're going to pay you if you get more companies in.
Yeah.
Because now you've just created a situation where these two are just going to knock heads, and nobody's going to be happy. So I think, first and foremost, their goals and objectives have to align. I think the second thing that I see the most of is I see this where supplier diversity people say, well, every January supply chain tells us what they're going to be bidding, or we get this rolling thing. Well, here's the thing. It's like, and you know this, when you're going out to bid, that's a poor time to be meeting new companies. So I think the key differentiator is if you are out there sourcing everything you buy all the time, you're going to be a lot more successful. Mm-hmm. I'll see a company, and I may know that contract isn't coming up for 3 years. But you know what? I think they'd be good. So let's talk a little bit. And I'm totally upfront with them. I'm not doing anything today, but let's stay in touch.
Yeah.
Because you never know what's going to happen. Something could go south with the company, with the incumbent. Mm-hmm. And it may not be 3 years. It may be next week. But by the same token, by the time that 3 years comes up, there's a relationship there.
Yeah.
And so if it's a known entity, they're much more likely to be part of the process than if you're just bringing people in cold. Oh, next month you want to do this? Well, here, I have 6 companies for you.
Right.
So I think that's the second thing. The third thing is, supply chain has this habit of, we don't want too many people bidding for this. And, back in the days, when I was a young chick, that was because you didn't want to have to read hundreds of pages, for 60 different companies.
Yeah.
But you know what? If that's still a problem for you, you need to take a serious look at your ERP system. Yeah. So I think we need to shelve that process and say, no, we need to get more in. So, this whole idea about we have one diverse supplier, on every bid. Well, yay you.
Mm-hmm. Check the box.
Yeah, exactly. And, and if you're doing something where there's only one, well, then maybe that's great. But if you're doing, I don't know, say contingent staffing, then, that's pretty paltry. It really has to do with what's out there and doing actual sourcing. One of my favorite things to find are diverse-owned companies in areas where there aren't a lot of diverse-owned companies. Because that, if you do that, you're not trading, I was spending the dollar with this MBE, now I'm spending it with this MBE. This is new money coming in. And that's really what this is about. I work with a lot of corporates whose programs have plateaued. We kicked it off, we got to 8, 12, 15%, and then that's where we've been for the past 6 years.
We got all these suppliers who are more known in the industry as being the I hate to use this term, but the go-to diverse supplier in IT peripherals or whatever. Yeah. And so we did the low-hanging fruit, and then it got a little bit harder.
Yeah, and so we've got the spend, and supply chain has checked their box, and everybody's checked their box, and look at us. Yeah. So and there's nothing wrong with having those companies, but the fact that we're just kind of then you just kind of go into cruise control is no, that's not what this is about. Yeah. This is about the more the merrier in terms of every time you're looking at opportunities, you need to be seeking this out. And a lot of that too has to do with supply chain and supplier diversity have to spend some time together. When I had responsibility for both, well, first of all, everybody had both titles on my team. So, I didn't want to, I figured
there's no delineation between the two.
I got enough complaining in my life. I don't need, supply chain complaining about supplier diversity and vice versa. We're just going to give them both and they'll figure it out. And they did. But I think the other thing too is, making sure that it's everything that we're bidding. And you're looking at it in the sense of, okay, what can we find? Mm-hmm. You're looking for it all the time. When you meet somebody who does something that's in that vast array of what your company purchases versus here's what they're doing in the next 90 days, I think that's where you start to see results.
Well, something that you mentioned just when you were talking about different tactics, and I just wanted to bring it back because I think it's powerful. You were talking about the development of suppliers, basically supply development and doing that in advance of when you ever have a need. And frankly, those are some of the tactics that had the biggest results for me. When you talk about cost savings, for example, or quality improvements, is starting to work closely to build, especially when you're in areas of spend that are perhaps in a monopolistic situation or you only have a couple of big players. You start developing a supplier in an area where perhaps they don't have the capabilities today, but in 2 or 3 years you're going to have. Then when you bring them in, there's obviously more leverage from a cost savings perspective, but you give them the business, you give them a portion of the business so they can start kind of demonstrating what they can do. That builds extremely strong collaborative supplier relationships in an area where before you may have just been, a number because there's only 2 or 3 players in the market.
I think, and I think there's some great things that you can do that's pretty easy that really helps build that. Mm-hmm. When I was doing, for lack of a better term, scorecard meetings with suppliers, part of the scorecard measurement was supplier diversity. And then when the ones who came in and we did it live, I would say, and who are you bringing in either physically or via video from your tier 2? I want to meet a couple of them and let them come in and see how some of these meetings go. Right. We've also had situations where, if we had a company that, was trying to get to the next level, find a bid process that's not in their industry. Mm-hmm. And I stress that because it shouldn't be giving them information, but let them set in on it. Mm-hmm. Let them see what your expectations are, how they're different. Because, they may have done business with me as a tier 2, and that's one type of relationship versus they want to take it to the next level. Okay, let's show you what that looks like for this company. And I think that goes a long way. But I also think that supply chain and supplier diversity need to do that for each other as well.
So it's about time to wrap up, Jamie. So first of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your experiences and insights around supply diversity. I think it's a topic that, quite rightly, will get even more important for organizations. And it's encouraging to hear more and more companies thinking about this proactively rather than reactively. And so
I hope so.
The very, very last question, and this is, I say in every pod, it's the easy one. If anybody would like to reach out directly to you, if they'd love to get a copy of the book, just find out a little bit more, where are the different places that you would direct them to?
I would direct them to, you can find me on LinkedIn, do a search on Jamie Crump. Also, you can check our website, which is www.therichwellgroup.com. Yeah. And in there is a link to me, a link to buying the book, and information on what we do.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to put those links in our show notes, and anybody who's listening can find those just by going to artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast, which is just where all of our podcasts that we have are linked, and find today's conversation with Jamie. So one last time, Jamie, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Phil. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.